today, so you're getting unflattering stills of me. You know, just mention we are. So this is our first breakfast of the season. I thank you all for joining us. I apologize and thank you for the flexibility in going all Zoom. We were looking at doing a in-person event and decided relatively recently that going all Zoom would be better. Stay tuned. We will be in touch about our future programming, and I'm going to get to that in a second. I'm just going to do a quick introduction, a few shout outs to now, and mention our upcoming programming. So I want to welcome you all to the start of Brotherhood season. I'll briefly introduce Mark Oppenheimer, because Rabbi Serkman will go a little more into him. We thank Mark for joining us. Mark is a noted scholar, author, and writer. Directs the Yale Journalism Initiative. He's a lecturer at Yale in the English department. He has written books about Jewish life and is with us today to talk about his current book, Squirrel Hill, Tree of Life, Shooting and the Soul of a Neighborhood, about the Squirrel Hill neighborhood in Pittsburgh. I want to thank my fellow Brotherhood board member, Andy Lackow, who was instrumental in bringing Mark to this, and Marty Cannongeiser for organizing this event and much of the Brotherhood programming, and to Jane, the Sable Friedman, and the office staff for their support of our efforts, and to all of you for joining Brotherhood and joining us today. We have established our programming for the rest of the year. Sunday, November 7th, that's the day we change the clocks and fall back, so don't forget that. We have Peter Coleman, professor of Columbia University. We'll talk about a book he's written called The Way Out, How to Overcome Toxic Polarization, in the political context, of course. And then on December 12th, Julie Metz, author of Eva and Eve, a memoir of her late mother's childhood in Nazi-occupied Austria and her journey to the United States. Lastly, I'll mention that the Squirrel Hill book is for sale, and if you want a copy, you have to email Marty Cannongeiser, mkanan@aol.com, and he will take the order, collect the payment. You'll write a check to Brotherhood for $25, and also indicate whether you want the book signed. Mark has graciously agreed to do so, and we'll send the signed book from him or an unsigned book from us. We have been talking with Anderson Book in Larchmont, who've been helpful with this and other programming with books. With that, I'm going to shut off my unflattering video, which I can't stand to look at, and turn it over to Rabbi Serkman.
It's great to be able to be here with everybody, and especially with Mark Oppenheimer. I didn't realize I've been reading Mark Oppenheimer's stuff for years in the New York Times. You know, Mark has an atypical journey for a PhD in religion, actually from Yale, who's now a lecturer at Yale. And he's taught in some hotsy-totsy places. He described himself, if you go as a writer and talker by trade, very Jewish, whose pieces appear everywhere from the Times to Slate to Mother Jones. But I get the impression that he's a master storyteller. His current project underscores that, Unorthodox on tablet, where he is the senior editor of a weekly News of the Jews program that brings, I listened to just one, sarcasm and a healthy self-critique about who we are and why it matters to the millions who either download it or tune in. His latest work is very connected to us, and we'll find out why along the way, and I think highly impactful. Jack Miles, wonderful religion writer and author, compared it to John Hersey's Hiroshima as it gives the feel of the story of the Tree of Life shooting and its aftermath, and really creates a weaving of the people and places and moments and madness in the oldest American Jewish neighborhood, revealing strands of the struggle and strength that can help us find the resolve to overcome hate through the hope that being a neighborhood brings. So without further ado, please, Mark Oppenheimer.
Thank you so much. Such an honor to be here, and I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. I was very keen to, but I understand that there are limitations in these times, and I'm glad that I'll reach more of you, even if it won't be in person. I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes at most, and then I want to take your questions, because that's really the most important thing to me. And as Larry is saying right now in the chat, you can put your questions in the chat, but feel free to think as I speak, what are the things that you want to reach out, grab me by the throat and say, but what about this? And we'll have time to talk about all of that afterwards. Thank you to everyone, to Andrew and Larry and Rabbi Sorkman for bringing me in. October 27th, 2018 was a very beautiful morning in Newton, Massachusetts, where I was with my eldest daughter, Rebecca. We were at a large conservative temple in Newton, where we had driven 2 hours from our home in New Haven to attend the bat mitzvah of a summer camp friend of hers from Camp Ramah, New England, which is where she's gone for the past 7 or 8 summers. And we, respecting the Sabbath, we had left our phones in the car, and we were inside the synagogue through all the morning service and then through a luncheon afterwards. Didn't get back to our car till 1:30 p.m. At which point I did open my phone just to see if my wife had checked in, and saw just dozens of text messages saying, "Are we going to Pittsburgh? Do you know anyone from Pittsburgh? Are you going to write anything about Pittsburgh? What are we going to do about Pittsburgh?" And I had no idea what any of this was about. I had been completely out of it for the past several hours. Someone is unmuted. If you could all just make sure you're muted, just so I don't get too, just so I get, don't get distracted. I'd really be grateful. Thank you. So there we were, and I had no idea what had happened. And I went over to one of my news apps on my phone, and I looked and saw that there had been this shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And I said, I sort of turned to my daughter, my 12-year-old daughter, and said, "Rebecca, there was a shooting in Squirrel Hill." And she said, "But Dad, isn't that where we're from?" And in a sense, yes. I grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts. My children are New Haveners, but my father was the 5th generation in his family to be from Pittsburgh. And they had been in Squirrel Hill for 3 generations, which is to say, as long as Squirrel Hill had been Jewish, they had been Squirrel Hill Jews. Squirrel Hill is the oldest, most stable Jewish neighborhood in the country, by my measurements. It's been substantially, that is to say, about 1/3 Jewish since World War I. So for about exactly a century now, since 1917 or 18, it has been a hub of Jewish life in Pittsburgh, and it remains so today. So I knew pretty quickly, as a religion writer with a family connection to what had happened, that I wanted to go to Pittsburgh, that I felt that I had to go to Pittsburgh. This story was pretty immediately calling out to me, especially once I found out the severity of it, that 11 people had died, that of the 22 people inside the Tree of Life building, 11 did not make it out alive. 2 more were wounded. 9 of them, including the 1 Gentile in the building, the custodian, did emerge unscathed, but 11 of the 22 were dead. The worst anti-Semitic slaughter in American history, ever to happen on American soil since nationhood or before. Nothing else even comes close. So I started going to Pittsburgh a few weeks later. I made my first trip in November, the next month, and I ended up going 32 times over 18 months and interviewing about 250 people. My question was never about the shooter, and this is very, very important. I want everyone to understand this. I was not interested in writing a book about the alleged shooter, who it seems quite certain did the crime, but I say alleged because there has been no trial yet. He's still up for trial. It's supposed to start in the next few months. I was not interested in learning about this man. I was not interested in spending time in what I presumed was the bigoted, white nationalist, anti-Semitic swamp of the internet that he spent his time on. That was not interesting to me. And perhaps curious to some people, I also was not setting out to write a book about the 11 victims. I ended up learning something about each of the 11 victims, and they sounded like beautiful people taken from us too soon, even though some of them had lived quite full lives. They ranged in ages from their 50s into their 90s, and everything I heard about them was lovely. But that was not the book that I wanted to write. Instead, the book that I felt called to write was really about the neighborhood. It was about Squirrel Hill itself. I was curious about how an old, stable Jewish neighborhood with many families that had been there for generations, with walkable streets, with wonderful, robust institutions, a neighborhood where within 1 square quarter mile, you had the post office, the elementary school, the high school, a whole bunch of synagogues, the kosher butcher, the supermarket, the bookstore, you name it. It was all right there, the public library. What would it mean for this neighborhood's resilience and its strength that it had so much social capital, that people loved each other so much, had lived together for so long, bumped into each other on street corners? Somebody just described to me your corner of the world in Larchmont as a kind of Jewish Mayberry. That is very much something you could apply to Squirrel Hill. And as I said, you could say it about Squirrel Hill for longer than just about any Jewish neighborhood in the country. So that was what I wanted to do, was I wanted to go spend time in Squirrel Hill and see not who the shooter was, not the before, who was the shooter, or even who were the victims, though each of them deserves a book of their own for sure. What I really wanted to see was, what was the after? When all the news cameras left, when Good Morning America and the Today Show and Anderson Cooper were no longer interested after the first couple weeks had passed, what became of the neighborhood? How did the people help each other? How did they care for each other? How did they help each other heal? And one of the things that I discovered was that it wasn't a sad story at all, that it actually ended up being an incredibly hopeful story. And that's the biggest misconception when people ask me about my work, is they say, oh, that must have been such a depressing book to write. And I said, no, there were times when it was sad, but it was never, ever, ever depressing. In fact, it was quite hopeful, quite optimistic, because what you see in the aftermath of disaster or tragedy, and this is true of the aftermath of natural disasters as well, is that actually it brings out the best in people, that actually people end up caring for each other and helping each other and sharing with each other in ways that they don't always in more ordinary times. So what I want to do now is just give you a sense of the book by taking you through a little bit of a photo show of some of the photographs in my book. It was very, very important to me when I wrote this book, and I fought for this, that it be filled with photographs. Photographs are expensive to reproduce in a book, and editors and publishers actually often discourage people from having too many photographs because it raises the cost to them of producing the book. But this is a book with 60 photographs in it. Every 2 or 3 pages, there's a different photograph, because as much as I value my own abilities as an author to conjure an image, I don't think anything really conjures an image quite like an image. So the nice thing is that in the next few minutes, we're actually going to meet some of these people, and I'm just going to give you a sense of some of the scenes and the themes that came out through the photographs. And then we're going to come back together and I'm going to take your questions. Okay, that sound good? So let's see. Okay, so this is the cover of the book. You can all see me? You can see the book cover? Yes? All right, good. I assume that's a yes. This is the cover of the book. You can see this is the scene of one of the, I think this is outside the synagogue. Someone is lighting candles. There are a bunch of candles and flowers arranged outside the Tree of Life Synagogue on Shady Avenue. Okay, this is in the aftermath. The first thing that happened, of course, was that people didn't know what to do for the dead. So they started praying. And these are 3 people who are not members of the synagogue. The woman on the left is Tammy Hepps. She ends up being a very important person in my book. She is a very involved Jew, but she's involved at a different synagogue at Beth Shalom. But she woke up that morning, she heard the sirens, she found out what happened, and the first thing she did was she reached for her book of Psalms. If you can see that book there, you can see it says Tehillim. That is her volume of Psalms. And of course, the tradition is that you read Psalms over the bodies of the dead. So she just went to the street corner. She just went there, and she ended up bumping into her friends Kate and Simone Rothstein. They have their arms around each other, and they're just reading Psalms outside the building while the dead bodies are still inside. Now, the next day, and this is quite extraordinary, she bumps into this man. Now, some of you have probably seen news coverage of this man. He died last year. His name was Greg Zanis. He was on 60 Minutes. He was on the Today Show. He was everywhere. And he was this non-Jew, an evangelical Christian from Aurora, Illinois, who ran a nonprofit called Crosses for Losses. And what he did was he tried to make a cross for every person who died a violent death in a kind of public way in America. So police officers who were killed, people who died in plane crashes, but also victims of mass shooting, Columbine, Parkland, Las Vegas, you name it. He would get in his truck, drive there by himself. He put millions of miles on his truck and put a hand-painted cross, a hand-constructed cross in the ground. And for Jews, it was, well, we'll get to that in a minute, but there was a problem because, of course, with Jews, you don't necessarily want it to be a cross. This is one of the other Gentiles who came on the scene and wanted to speak out for Jews. This is an African-American man whom we've never, ever identified. But this photograph went viral. He was standing in front of a Presbyterian church with a sign that said Jewish Lives Matter. And that was very meaningful to a lot of people. I want to read to you a little bit here as we talk about the Gentile support for these Jews in the days after. I want to read to you about when Tammy Hepps, who was holding the book of Psalms, bumped into Greg Zanis, who was trying to put crosses in this Jewish site, which of course would have been very offensive to a lot of people because Jews, the cross is a Christian symbol. But listen to what happened. Okay, so this is the only part I'm going to read. The rest is all going to be a photo slideshow. But I want to read you one page of the book. As Hepps remembered it, this is when she's bumping into Greg Zanis outside the synagogue. She just randomly happens to be standing outside the synagogue when his truck pulls up. As Hepps remembered it, she looked into Zanis's truck and saw a pile of crosses in the back. They were all white, and on a quick count, she decided there were 11 of them. As soon as she grasped what she was seeing, she was incensed. I thought to myself, you have got to be fucking kidding me, Hepps remembered. And I looked around and no one else was there. And I thought, if I have to be the one to tell him he can't put crosses on the synagogue, I will be the one to tell him he can't put crosses on a synagogue. Hepps had no idea who this guy was with this kind of nerve. As she was figuring out what to say to him, trying to keep her cool, she saw on the front seat of his truck a pile of wooden six-pointed stars. She was relieved. I thought, okay, what will happen here is he's going to put the stars of David on the crosses and it will be okay. Zanis got out on the driver's side of the truck and approached Hepps. She looked him up and down. He was tired, unshaven, old. What was he doing here? Where had he come from? Then she looked down and saw his hands, and it was as if something became clear. I saw his hands were covered in white paint, Hepps remembered. It's like he painted these things overnight and didn't even have time to wash his hands. He told me his intention, said to me, I made these things, got in my truck and drove 9 hours. There was white paint on his hands. He said to me, I've been driving the whole time. I don't even know the names of the people who died. I have to write their names on the stars. This was part of his practice, was he always wrote the name in black on the back of a white cross or a white Star of David. And then Hepps knew what she had to do. Her mother had emailed her the full list of the dead that morning, so she had the names on her phone. Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, Irv Younger. I brought up this list and he said to me, can you please write the names in my notebook? And he handed me a pen and his notebook, and I was shaking as I copied these names into his notebook. I have terrible handwriting, so he could write the names on the stars. When Hepps had written down all 11 names, she gave Zanis's notebook back to him. But now she had a question for him. I said to him, why do you do this? He said there had been gun violence in his family, and that was his response. He said, do you remember Parkland? I did that one. Do you remember Columbine? I did that one too. It had never occurred to me, Hepps said, that it was one person who had made it his life's work to drive around the country and do this. And at that moment, I realized we were just another one on the list. So what I want us to take from that is this is an encounter that happens within 48 hours after the shooting. And it's a conservative Jewish woman encountering an evangelical Christian, and they're bonding over what he's trying to do for these people, which is plant white stars of David in the lawn in the synagogue. And those ended up becoming iconic. They were in front of the synagogue for a long time. Then they were moved inside the glass doors. You can still see them there. And that was so typical of what happened in the first couple days, was this sense of people coming together, Jews and Gentiles, this man showing up, having driven 9 hours overnight, African American, holding up signs saying Jewish lives matter. Now, one of the iconic symbols that you also found in the area was this symbol, and the football fans here will recognize that this is a riff on the Pittsburgh Steelers logo, but the yellow element, the yellow hypocycloid, which is what that geometric shape is called, has been replaced by a yellow Star of David. So it's a mashup of the Pittsburgh Steelers football logo and the yellow Star of David with the sign stronger than hate. This was created in the hours right after the shooting by a Lutheran American graphic designer named Tim Hindis at his home in the suburbs of Pittsburgh. And within 24 hours, it was everywhere. You saw it in shop windows, in Squirrel Hill. You saw it the next day at the Pittsburgh Steelers football game. You still see it everywhere. And again, it became the iconic symbol of the shooting, but it's a creation of a Gentile ally, Tim Hindis. The front page of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette that Friday carried this line, and those of you who read Hebrew will recognize what it says: Yitgadal v'yitgadash Shemei Rabbah. The last letter is incorrect. It's a hey, and it should be an aleph. But no matter. It was editor David Shribman's idea that the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette should run its first ever Hebrew headline on a morning when Jews were being laid to rest in the ground. This ended up becoming one of the iconic symbols of the week after the shooting. Some other iconic symbols which you can still see today. What is more American than Starbucks? What is more Squirrel Hill than the Starbucks on Forbes Avenue? This is the busier of the two Starbucks within a half mile of each other in Squirrel Hill. And you will notice the signage in the windows. There are 3 painted signs. The first one says Ahava, love. The second one says Chesed, kindness. And the third one says Tikva, hope. And we have the sign of a Star of David and a tree of life and a dove. These were painted by a Catholic woman who had been asked by the Presbyterian Starbucks manager, would you do something artistic in the windows that shows our support for this community? And this signage became iconic and is still in those windows, and I think probably will be forever. You could go have a Frappuccino there right now and see that signage. Another bit of beautiful, touching signage, if you notice, this is the Squirrel Hill sign on Forward Avenue when you get off the freeway. If you'll notice the H, there is a little Star of David hanging from the H. These crafted Star of David, some were cut out, some were macrameed or crocheted or knitted. They were all over Squirrel Hill, and they had come in from around the world, having been organized by certain Facebook groups of people who wanted to do craft work for Squirrel Hill. You saw these hanging from trees, you saw them hanging from lampposts, you saw them hanging from statues and from signs. And this picture was taken after a very brutal winter when many of the other little Stars of David had fallen off the lettering, but this one was still left. And I took a picture of it. I got it on my car and snapped a photo of it. The next time I was in town, I actually found it on the ground and saved it because the little ribbon holding it to the H had finally snapped. Something else that happens after a big mass tragedy is that people want to give money. About $7 million rolled into various funds set up to help the synagogues and the victims' families afterwards. I say synagogues, by the way, because as some of you know, there were 3 congregations inside Tree of Life. There was the main congregation, and then they rented space to 2 others. So there were 3 congregations that lost their home. This fellow is not a Jew. His name is Sheikh Khatiri. He's an Iranian-American expatriate. He's not yet a citizen. He's a permanent resident of the United States. He's right now a graduate student at Johns Hopkins, holding his beloved volume of Plato, standing in front of the White House. He set up a GoFundMe campaign in the hours after the shooting because he loved Jews. Some of his favorite Americans he had met were Jews, and he didn't understand why anyone wanted to hurt us. So he set up this GoFundMe campaign that raised over $1 million in under a week, and ended up being the single largest fundraising effort started by an individual in the aftermath of it. Again, he is by ancestry a Muslim Iranian. He considers himself irreligious, but here he is coming in as a Gentile ally to help the Jews, and that was one of the most beautiful things you could see. But this is something that Jews were doing for themselves, although again with Gentile allies. This is the Havdalah service, the service marking the end of the Sabbath, that was organized, in fact, at that Starbucks on Forbes Avenue. That afternoon, a bunch of teenagers from Alderdice High School got together and decided that they wanted to do something. They wanted to plan something for the community. And so they organized in a matter of a few hours. They got hundreds of candles and flowers and a microphone, and they got together at the corner, the intersection of Forbes and Murray, which is the big crossroads in Pittsburgh. It's also where the Presbyterian Church, where Mr. Rogers used to worship, is located. And at that crossroads, they had a Havdalah service where they lit candles that night at nightfall. You can see across the intersection people, several thousand people with their candles. Some of them, no doubt, holding up phones, using that as a flashlight or a lighter, and you can see the umbrellas because it had been raining off and on all day. This is just a picture of a girl, we don't know who she is, holding a candle at the Havdalah service. Pretty soon, however, other people wanted to come to town. That is Donald Trump and as you know, with the former First Lady Melania, and that's with the Rabbi of Tree of Life, Jeffrey Myers. Now, this ended up, he came on the Tuesday after the shooting. So again, the shooting was a Saturday, was Shabbat. And within about 24 hours, Donald Trump said, I'm coming to town. And immediately, people who were fans of Trump said, this is great. Of course, the president should come. What would we think of him if he didn't come? And people who did not want the president to come organized to ask him to stay away. And this was very contentious because, there were two schools of thought. One is, of course, it's a president's role to come to something like that. The other was people who felt that his ideology perhaps had helped inspire the shooter and felt that it was inappropriate. And also people who felt that for him to come in the middle of the funerals, there were several days of funerals, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Everything was busy. The intersections were already crowded. Traffic was already terrible. People were sitting Shiva. And they just felt that for his motorcade to come in on such a day as that was inappropriate, and perhaps he could wait. But he ended up coming, and the picture that you saw is is of him meeting with the rabbi. The rabbi did receive him and had some words with him. Nobody knows what they talked about. There are people who are hopeful that the rabbi used the time to encourage Trump to tone down his rhetoric or endorse gun control or something. But you can see them in front, and of course you see the Stars of David, those are the Stars of David that Greg Zanis built and that Tammy Hepps gave him the names for. The rabbi took the president inside the building for about 20 minutes, and then this is them afterwards standing outside. The protest that was organized was very, very large, one of the largest mass gatherings of Jews in Pittsburgh history. More Jews came together to protest Donald Trump's arrival than probably had ever come together for anything, though probably there have been more Jews inside the baseball or football stadiums rooting on the Pirates or the Steelers than either, but those wouldn't be specifically Jewish gatherings. Some of you will see what's going on here. These are people at the anti-Trump protest who, as an act of mourning, have torn pieces of black paper in half, the Jewish act of Korea, as when someone dies and you either tear a piece of your garment or you put a black ribbon on your garment and rip that. They're signaling their sadness and their mournfulness over the Trump visit by tearing pieces of black paper in the Korea gesture. This is a photograph that I left out of my book because my editor said to me, this could hurt its ability to get into high schools. Maybe we should keep obscenity or this photograph out. So I left it out, but I'm sharing it with you because you can see the police officer in the foreground, the sign in the background. It gives you a sense of what is going on, what that day was like. And this is the one person who was arrested that day. His name is Joshua Bloom. He's a sociology professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and he lay down in front of Trump's motorcade and meditated and chanted as an act of protest. And this is him being dragged away by the Pittsburgh police. He was arrested, never charged, and released the next day. One of the things that happens after a mass shooting is celebrities come. So not just Donald Trump, but this, of course, is America's sweetheart, Tom Hanks, hugging Mrs. Rogers, Fred Rogers' widow, Joanne Rogers, who is, I believe, recently may have died. But wasn't she? They were Squirrel Hill residents until the very end. So this was a kind of special thing for Tom Hanks to come and to embrace her. And this is a photograph I snapped myself. I took the photograph on Shabbat, so inside a synagogue. Please forgive me. I'll ask for everyone's forgiveness. But I couldn't resist the opportunity to take a photograph of Robert Kraft, the owner of the New England Patriots, in a Steelers Stronger Than Hate yarmulke. I figured there's probably no example in history of the Patriots owner wearing Steelers garb. So it seemed to me a special thing. But Robert Kraft, who grew up in a fairly religious Jewish home, was in town for the Patriots to play the Steelers, and he came to services at Tree of Life and put on that Stronger Than Hate Steelers yarmulke that day. There he is talking to the Rabbi, Jeffrey Myers. In the aftermath of a mass shooting, one of the things that happens is there is trauma therapists all have different prescriptions for what people need. So some of you are familiar with therapy animals. There were therapy dogs everywhere. Therapy dogs came in from out of town. Therapy dogs came in from the suburbs. Therapy dogs came in from the heart of Squirrel Hill. This was a beautiful photograph. I kind of wanted it to be the cover of my book, if I'm being honest, but there's no real argument. It wouldn't really have telegraphed what the book is about. I just love dogs. You can see this little girl petting this beautiful dog. And if you see the sign that she's holding, if you squint, you can see that it says, "Thank you for keeping the Jews in my neighborhood safe. Thank you for risking your lives to save my Jewish community. Love, Mikey, age 9, or Mickey, age 9." I imagine it's for the police. People brought the police and firefighters a lot of gifts and notes and cards in the aftermath. I'm getting to the end of the show here, but I wanted to include this gentleman. His name is Joe Charney. He was the oldest survivor of the shooting. He was in the building that day, and he got out alive. And we had a very, very interesting conversation in which we talked about trauma and about what people need in the aftermath of trauma. And he was a little bit disdainful of all of the therapists and the healers and the therapy dogs and all of the sense that people needed a lot of care and healing and therapy. You know, what he said to me was basically, I served in World War II. I saw terrible things. And a lot of bad stuff has happened to me in my life. And surviving this shooting, you know, getting out alive was actually not one of the worst things that ever happened to me. You know, it was a difficult day, but I'm here and I'm fine. And when his kids came to visit and said, you know, "Dad, let us stay with you for a while," he sent them home. His grown children, he sent them home to Baltimore and California and said, "I'm fine. I don't really need this. I don't need your help. I don't need support groups." And it just showed an interesting tension that you see in the aftermath, where some people feel very like they need the support of their community, and some people go it alone a little bit. A little coda of Joe Charney, which is that he, as I was about to leave, and I was saying, "Now, how many children did you have again?" And he said 3, but one of them died. And I said, how did he die?" And he said, "Well, he was gay and he got AIDS in the early days before there were any treatments, and he died of AIDS." So it occurred to me, you know, that when you've been a soldier in war, and then when you've lost your son to a terrible illness, all the more reason that this actually, in his 9 decades, seemed like one of the smaller events. So that was just, you know, just one perspective there. And then I want to close with this slide. This is a fellow named Robert Zacharias. He grew up in New Jersey as a fairly secular Reformed Jew. And he was living in Pittsburgh. He was not going to synagogue. He was teaching at Carnegie Mellon University. And the day after the day of the shooting, he was going to that vigil that the teenagers had planned. And he put on a yarmulke. He reached into his closet, found a yarmulke, and put it on and wore it there. And then he didn't take it off all day. And then he didn't take it off the next day. And he put it on the morning after that and the day after that. And he became this yarmulke wearing Jew. He didn't necessarily get more observant. He's not an Orthodox Jew now. He's not someone who is Shomer Shabbos, as far as I know. I've stayed in touch with him a little bit. But here he is in the park in Pittsburgh with a challah that he made. The picture's taken by his girlfriend, Molly. And he just became a more public, visible Jew in that one particular way. If you squint, you can sort of see the yarmulke on the back of his head, though it's not very visible here. And I think that, just in conclusion, what was so interesting to me is all the different ways that people changed, that people transformed. There were Gentiles who stepped up by really caring for Jews. There were Jews who stepped up by becoming more involved in synagogue, or there was a Muslim who stepped up by donating money. And then you have this Jew who stepped up by just saying, I'm going to dress a little bit differently and be a little bit more publicly visible and proud about my Judaism. And so what you see is that the aftermath of an event like this has so many different facets, that people change in so many different ways. And there's so many little tiny stories out there. And that you end up having in Squirrel Hill a whole neighborhood of people, only 11 of whom died, 11 of whom got out, but with thousands of stories all around them. And that ultimately is what the book is about. So thank you. Let me stop there and take your questions, because I'm sure that you have some, and I'm excited to hear what you think and what I can tell you more about.
Thank you, Mark. I see there's a question from that's in the chat. On Yom Kippur, we heard a discussion led by executives from the ADL about growth of anti-Semitism in America. The response you observed from Squirrel Hill reflects something much different. How are we to square these alternate realities?
Well, so I'm assuming the ADL talk was about rising anti-Semitism in America. And so is that the question? How do we square the kind of support that people had and got from their neighborhood in Squirrel Hill with the fact that, statistically speaking, there seems to be a rise in anti-Semitic acts in America? Is that the question?
So it would appear, yes.
So it would appear, okay, because I obviously wasn't at that talk, but thank you, Lee. Well, they are both true, but the reality is that anti-Semitism in America is low and has always been relatively low, but percentage-wise, it has gone up, and they're both true, which is that most people are not anti-Semites, and most people are ashamed whenever anyone from their perceived community does anything terribly violent, and will reach out to help people in the aftermath of that. That said, we are a country of 300 some odd million people, and so it only takes one madman filled with hate to perpetrate a crime like this. I am both a realist about the existence of anti-Semitism and its rise as measured by indices like online hatred, people posting anti-Semitic stuff on Twitter and Facebook. Swastika graffiti is one of the big things that the ADL tracks, graffiti on benches or in bathrooms or wherever, or scrawled on buildings. Those are worrisome. I am far more worried because I think a lot of those acts are not necessarily by people who have violent impulses, but people who just want to cause mayhem, right? The truth is, especially with young people, a lot of them don't really understand Jews or anti-Semitism. Knowledge of the Holocaust is receding. People are woefully ignorant. A lot of people know that the swastika is a terrible sign, but they don't really understand. They couldn't explain to you its connection to Nazism and what Nazism was. So I am less worried about the graffiti, which is one of the things that the ADL tracks, as it should, than I am with violent acts. I mean, at the end of the day, I think that what worries most of us is the fear that someone will actually hurt us or hurt our property. And violent acts are still pretty minuscule, pretty rare, but they are on the rise. They are on the rise, however, specifically against one group, which is Orthodox Jews who are identifiably Jewish. So most of the violent acts against Jews in America are committed against men who are identifiable as Orthodox because of the black hats they wear, because of the payas that they have, or so forth and so on. This is an overwhelmingly safe country for Jews who are not immediately identifiable as Jewish on the streets. It is true there has been some graffiti on synagogues. It's true that there have been shootings in 2 of them, 3 if you count Muncie, New York. That was a rabbi's home. This is still incredibly rare. What's less rare is Orthodox Jews who are attacked on the streets of Brooklyn, which was something that was happening a lot 2 winters ago and tends not to get reported by the secular media, which is filled with non-Orthodox Jews. And so I think, to me, the real bellwether we want to look at is how are the most identifiably Jewish people being treated? And the answer is increasingly with violence. So that's where I put the focus. I think it's really important to have that distinction between graffiti, which is worrisome but ultimately not terrifying, and people being attacked on the streets, which does tend to happen, but not to Reform and conservative communities. What next?
Okay, thank you. So as a country, we often react to events in the short term and then too quickly snap back to our old ways in the longer term. Is this happening in Squirrel Hill, or do you see a longer term change?
Oh, this happens everywhere. I mean, this is human nature, right? And that's adaptive. The idea that we snap back to normal is how we should be, is how we've evolved to be. No one can really survive and thrive. No one can survive happily and healthily and thrive in a constant state of crisis. So it's a good thing that people are generally adaptive and generally move on. What I would say is that Jews around the country are a little more safety conscious now. Again, if they're doing Jewish things, identifiably Jewish things, like going into a synagogue or going into a Jewish community center or attending a talk by me, let's say, people are a little more wary and a little more hopeful that there will be a security presence. In Pittsburgh, I think that's even truer. And I certainly know people whose trauma from that day, when they hear a siren, they still worry, is it a synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh? What's really, again, both worrisome, but entirely to be expected in terms of human nature, is that most Gentiles have completely forgotten that there was an attack on a synagogue in Pittsburgh. If I say to a Gentile whom I meet, who finds out I'm a writer, and he says, "What are you writing about?" And I say, the shooting in Pittsburgh, I get blank stares almost always. They don't remember that there's been a shooting in Pittsburgh. Now, of course, there have been so many acts of mass violence in America since the Columbine shooting in 1999 that it's not surprising that people, forget. I mean, does every one of us remember Aurora, Illinois, or, Dayton, Ohio? I mean, there've been dozens and dozens and dozens of cities where these things have happened. So Jews remember Pittsburgh to some extent, but non-Jews tend to have forgotten Pittsburgh. And I think that's sad, but it's entirely expectable. What else can I tell you?
Okay. Thank you. Next question. What is the engagement of the broader community with Squirrel Hill today in October 2021?
I mean, the broader community, if we mean the Pittsburgh community, Squirrel Hill is a thriving, lively, beloved part of Pittsburgh. It's not all Jewish. It's about a third Jewish, if that. It has a rising Asian American population. It has, the majority or the plurality group would be white Gentiles. Has a small number of African Americans, small number of Latinos. So it's Pittsburgh is a city of neighborhoods, and all of the neighborhoods are, no one neighborhood is monolithically everything, but although some are, majority Black, for example. But people use the Squirrel Hill shopping district. There are people who come to its synagogues and churches who are not from Squirrel Hill. There are people who shop there who are not from Squirrel Hill. I mean, it's Alderdice High School draws from beyond just Squirrel Hill. So it's very integrated with the rest of the city. I imagine that the fact that there continue to be those little Stars of David, the stronger than hate sign in the shop windows, is one of the things that keeps people's memory of this particular shooting alive. But I think it's also important to remember that that attacks on Jews matter a lot to Jews, but other people tend to move on, just as we tend to move on when we see attacks on communities that aren't our own either. And one of the critiques in the aftermath of this was from some African-American students at Alderdice High School who said, you know, we've had peers of ours who have been shot. There was a African-American named Rose, was his last name, Antoine Rose, who was shot in a police-involved shooting, I believe, the summer before outside the Pittsburgh city limits and died. And they said, you know, we remember this better than our white and Jewish friends do. And why did the deaths of Jews get so much attention, not the deaths of Black people? And you could say, well, this was a mass attack. 11 people died. When there was the attack on the Black church in Charleston, South Carolina, 9 people died. It was a national event. So you could have various answers, but the reality is, it is true of all groups that we tend to focus on killings that feel closest to us for understandable reasons. And one student said to me, one non-Jewish student said to me that when she got to school the Monday after the attack, a lot of her friends didn't know what had happened. A lot of her non-Jewish friends didn't know what had happened. They got all their news from Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat, and nobody had posted anything about Jews being shot in Squirrel Hill because it just didn't seem relevant to their community. And these were students at Alderdice High School in Squirrel Hill. So we do have to remember that we are a tiny minority people surrounded by a country of non-Jews who generally like us, but also have other concerns. That's how I would put it.
Thank you. So I have a question. This one looks like it came to me and not to everyone.
Okay.
I'm reading it to you, so you'll hear it cold. Sounds like you wrote this to reassure people. Is that really what's needed at the present time?
I did not write this to reassure people. That's not how a good journalist operates. I don't write with an agenda. I write with, I write what I see. I mean, the goal is to say true things, right? So what I saw in Squirrel Hill was, had a lot of hopefulness in it. It also had a tremendous amount of sadness in it. It is a book about the murder of 11 people and the wounding of 2 others, and I don't shy away from that. I spend a lot of time in the book speaking with people who were inside and got the scare of their lives. Daniel Legger, who nearly bled to death, is a very prominent character in the book. Barry Werber, who was inside, got out unscathed, but psychologically was quite shaken up and is still coping with that. And I talk a lot about that. So I apologize if I gave the misimpression that I don't deal with the kind of sadness underlying this. It is, of course, a heartbreaking thing that happened, and I have probably talked more about it than anyone else who I've probably heard and heard more about it from more different people than anyone else who didn't live it, and that that stays with me every day. But I don't really understand the question. Is that really what people need? I mean, the concern of a journalist isn't what people need or don't need, but rather going there, interviewing people, and telling their stories as truthfully as possible. So that's the only thing I'm trained to do.
I see. All right. Thank you. So another one. I saw that you wrote a blurb for Dara Horn's new and very angry book, People Love Dead Jews. Among other things,
Yeah.
She argues that Holocaust education has apparently been a failure given the recent rise in anti-Semitism. Whew, we get some interesting ones here. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a wonderful book. Everyone should read Dara Horn's book, People Love Dead Jews, which argues what the title says, which is that people, there's a lot of, if you think of Schindler's List, for example, if you think of the Diary of Anne Frank, the thing that gets millions of people to engage with Judaism, especially Gentiles, is when it's stories about us being killed, or stories of people who ended up being killed. So whereas the interest of most Gentiles, and in fact of many Jews, I would add, and I think she would add as well, in actual Jewish practice today and how Jews are living in Israel, in the diaspora, in Orthodox communities and secular communities, in the ongoing vitality of Yiddish and Hebrew is pretty weak. People like the Holocaust as a way to consume their knowledge of Jews. And so I think she's right. I think the book argues that very well. I don't remember her specific points about Holocaust education. You know, I don't have a strong stance on, you know, I didn't get any of it in high school. I'm sure it was mentioned in my European history class, but it is certainly not one of the things that we teach a lot of or teach particularly well. But we're in a country that doesn't teach history particularly well at all. I mean, we've all seen the surveys of what happens if you go ask, 100 people what were the dates of the Civil War, and how few of them know. So I don't have any unreasonable expectation that Holocaust education about our Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust, as opposed to the Armenian genocide or the Rwandan genocide. I mean, these things are all completely untaught or taught poorly in a country that doesn't take history very seriously. So I'm sure she's right about that. But the book is really about something much bigger, which is that people find Jews curious when they're either, people like Jews to be elderly or cute or dead, but they don't have a particularly strong interest in ongoing Jewish vitality as it's being lived in the here and now. And, that is a conundrum of Holocaust education that we've essentially, and this is true of our Hebrew schools and Jewish high schools and Jewish studies departments as well, which is that we can get good enrollment and good attention talking about the murder of 5 to 6 million Jews. But it's a lot harder to get people to want to talk about, Simchas Torah, which was last week, right? So this is an irony, and we have to confront it, and we have to wonder why it's true nationally, outside of the Jewish community, but also I think true in ourselves. And that's one of the things Dara is very, very good on.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw this in, if I can. First of all, Mark, wonderful listening to you and learning from you, and the book is great, and everybody should buy it. I remember Deborah Lipstadt's piece. I think it was in the forward, like the month after Pittsburgh, where remember who Deborah Lipstadt is, professor of Jewish religion and at Emory, former chair of the department. Amazing, Holocaust, educator, and who's up against, the Holocaust deniers in Britain. But she said, interestingly, what we take away from Pittsburgh is that fighting anti-Semitism cannot be the fulcrum of our Jewish identities. That what we learned from that neighborhood is that we are here for each other, but if we're only here in times of tragedy and loss, we're missing the point.
Yeah, I mean, one of the sections of my book, I talk about Rabbi Meyer's sermon at the Yontif after the shooting. The shooting happened in October. The high holidays already passed, so the next high holidays were 11 months later. And one of the things he said in the sermon, I think it was his Yom Kippur sermon, it might have been his Rosh Hashanah, I forget, it's in the book, was, 11 Jews were murdered. Have 11 Jews stepped up to come to Minyan and to join and to start, these were 11 Jews who were there early on a Saturday morning. These were the heart of 3 communities. These were people who showed up, who helped make the Minyan, who read Torah, who helped prepare the cookies and coffee for afterwards. These were the people who did. And we're the 11 people. I mean, people donated money, they sent checks, millions of dollars rolled in, but we're the 11 people who were going to start showing up the way that they showed up. And that's a really profound question, right? I mean, and look, but my book is not for the Jews. It's for anyone who's interested in neighborhood and community and resilience and stories. I do think, however, that there is a kind of special question for the Jews, which I don't think any Jew can read my book and not ask themselves like what their role is, if any. And it's not for me to assign roles, right? Except to my kids, and even then, they grow up and do what they want. But I think for a lot of Jews, they find that they're asking themselves in the aftermath of something like this, what is our role? And one of the things is about how Jews do Judaism is it's much easier to raise money for Holocaust memorialization than it is for sort of ongoing Jewish activity in the here and now in 2021. And that is an interesting fact that Dara Horn confronts us with, that Deborah Lipstadt confronts us with. And I think they're right. I think they're right.
Yeah. Underscore Mark what you said. By the way, I just almost finished reading Darahorn's book, and and it I think it is so powerful, and I think it's a great takeaway in a way from your wonderful work, which is there is an overarching life lesson about a neighborhood resilience that we can learn that transcends the Jewish people. And that is about how, and if the pandemic didn't teach us this, what did? How interconnected this world really is, and how what one person does matters to the next person.
I mean, yes, but especially when people live near each other and are in community with each other. And I think that one of the things that made the Tree of Life attack different from attacks on many, many other spaces in America is this was an attack on a group of people who had chosen to lead lives together as fellow shul goers, as fellow synagogue goers in a tight-knit urban enclave. A lot of attacks happen at a movie theater or a shopping mall, and they occur to a group of people who don't know each other and have nothing in common, who just happen to be in the shopping mall or at the concert or at the movie theater that day. And that's a very different thing, because then what you have is families who don't know each other coming from a bunch of different towns. They all just happen to be at the shopping mall off of exit 73 or whatever that day. And their experience in the aftermath is much more kind of separated, much more atomized, much more dispersed and kind of lonely than in Squirrel Hill. And that's one of the things that I wanted to get at, is that there's something, nobody would wish this kind of attack on any community. But if there was any community that had some resources to care for itself in the aftermath of it, it was in fact Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh.
Yeah. I'm going to go run and do a baby now talking about L'chaim into life, but everybody should read it in Mark's book, and the opportunity to get it autographed and inscribed by Mark is pretty cool. So I appreciate it. Keep talking. I know you are a limited time as well. You got to do another presentation.
I have about, we started about 10 minutes late. I certainly can give about 8 or 10 more minutes and would love to if there are more questions. I'm not monitoring the chat, but if anyone sees it or if anyone just wants to pipe up with a question, I'm super excited to be here for a full hour.
Mark, thanks.
Especially, we have one more.
You bet. Yeah.
Thanks.
And you guys
Thanks,
are my
Rabbi.
neighbors. You're like 50 minutes away the way I drive.
The one question I have in the chat that we haven't gotten to yet says, sure. What surprised you most positive and negative, and positively, negatively, I guess, on your time in Squirrel Hill?
Positively, that's a wonderful question. Positively, I can't say enough about just what a warm neighborhood it is. There's an endless debate in Pittsburgh about whether Pittsburgh is part of the Midwest. It's definitely not the East Coast. It's hours and hours and hours from Philadelphia, New York, and it's inland. And but many of them, true Midwesterners, people from Ohio, which is like minutes away, will say, well, Pittsburgh's not the Midwest. But there is a niceness to it, a decency. It is a place where people don't run through yellow lights. That tells you a lot. If people actually stop for the yellows and stop to let people pass, there is a decency to it that I think serves it very well. And it feels very Midwestern to me, or at least my stereotype of the Midwest as a lifelong Easterner. And you can't overstate just the warmth of the people, the decency, the hospitality. So it did surprise me, even though I knew to expect it. And again, my dad grew up there. I still was amazed by it. I'll give you a bonus positive thing. The Jewish community in Squirrel Hill is quite integrated Jewishly. That is to say, Orthodox Jews and secular and Reform and conservative and Reconstructionist Jews all know each other more or less and live near each other and share some of the same institutions, the JCC, the certain markets, so forth and so on, the public library. So that is not true, for example, in New York City, a little bit on the Upper West Side, but the vast majority of New York City's Orthodox live in Orthodox specific neighborhoods. And then there are neighborhoods that have huge numbers of secular and Reform Jews. But Pittsburgh, the Jews, they know each other across the Jewish spectrum better than anywhere else I've seen. So I think that's really cool. What I think the other one was like, what disappointed me the most or surprised me the most negatively? I mean, it was surprising to me that in the aftermath of the shooting, that Tree of Life didn't see a surge of membership. You would think the first thing that would happen is a lot of people would say, well, they just lost the Tree of Life lost 7 members, I think, and then the other congregations lost 3 and 1. But you know, they lost 7 members of their most committed, diehard members. You'd think there'd be 50 or 100 new membership units in the next year of people who just thought, well, I'm going to give money by taking out a membership. And as far as I can tell, that didn't happen. And that surprised me. You know, it's not for me to be disappointed or not disappointed. It's not my city. These are not my congregations. You know, I'm a journalist, and I have relatives there still. As I said, my family's from there originally, but I'm a New Englander. So I don't, you know, I don't have the emotional stake in it that the people who live there do. And I never want to pretend that I do. But I was surprised by that fact. So, yeah.
Okay, I think that closes the questions. I'll throw in one question of my own. You said early on that you regarded Squirrel Hill as the most stable Jewish neighborhood in the United States. And without debating that point, just describe a little bit sort of what's your sort of methodology or idea behind that. What makes a Jewish neighborhood stable over time? Right.
I mean, the methodology was really just a historian's methodology of saying, you know, what are the, you know, it has been a Jewish neighborhood. If you sort of say want to say there's a substantial number of Jews there, you know, 20% or more, we could say, for about 100 years. Now, there couldn't be many Jewish neighborhoods much older than that. I mean, the big massive Jewish immigration in America happened from 1880 to 1924 before the immigration laws became more restrictive again. So you'd be looking at a pretty circumscribed set of neighborhoods that are that old. And most of the ones that were Jewish in that time have ceased to be very Jewish. So it's hard, it's you know, Jonathan Sarna, the historian of Brandeis, wrote a review of my book in the Jewish Review of Books, in which he tossed out the Lower East Side, said I got it wrong. He said, well, the Lower East Side is just as old as Squirrel Hill. Well, I know the Lower East Side very well. My wife is a 3rd generation Lower East Sider. My in-laws still live on Grand Street. I'm there all the time. And the Lower East Side had, you know, something like 500,000 Jews by itself in 1920, you know, give or take. And nobody really knows for sure, but hundreds of thousands. And today, while the Lower East Side still has a few struggling synagogues, and you know, it's a ghost of what it once was. I mean, it has shrunk percentage-wise. It's, you know, the Lower East Side, there's no way that it's even 10% Jewish now. It's probably, you know, in the low single digits, and it's been, that community has been, you know, simply dwarfed by people of other ethnicities, by what they would call gentrifiers, public housing for the poor, gentrified housing for the rich. I mean, but none of it specifically Jewish in character. So really, it's just like, try to think of another neighborhood that for 100 years has had a meaningful Jewish presence. And I don't think you can. It's not the most important point in my book, but I think it's a fair claim. And also the stability of it. I mean, I go through the numbers because they did Jewish population surveys at various points over the past century. And you can see it, like, if you look at Squirrel Hill and then also include some of the other East End neighborhoods like Regent Square, Greenfield, et cetera, you can see that, broadly speaking, the geographic neighborhood of East End urban Pittsburgh, so not the suburbs, but the east side of Pittsburgh, has been, you know, a quarter to a third, a little more, 35% Jewish, pretty much consistently every time they survey it. So that's how I looked at it. It's an interesting question, and there are historical reasons I get into in the book for why that's true, for why the Jews didn't leave for the suburbs en masse the way that they did in some other communities. It has been pointed out to me that the constitution of the neighborhood has changed. It is more religious now. The Orthodox have replaced a lot of departed secular Jews, but not exclusively. I mean, there's still very strong liberal Jewish institutions, Reformed, Conservative, Reconstructionist in Squirrel Hill. So it's been an interesting journey, and the book tackles that as well.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Sure.
All right. So I think we're at the point where we can wrap up. I want to thank everyone for joining. Mark, thank you for
yeah, you bet.
a great talk. Reach out to Marty Kannengeiser directly regarding if anyone wants the to get a copy of the book through us, and we'll happily facilitate that. And stay tuned for our next event on November 7th. And that'll be announced on via the temple website and weekly emails shortly. Okay.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really such a delight.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you. That was great. Thanks.